Welcome everyone to the first concert of our 2021-2022 season. My name is Pratik Gandhi and I am delighted to be the guest conductor for the Cathedral Bluffs Symphony Orchestra for this opening concert. The musicians and I are very excited to perform two exceptional masterworks for you on Saturday evening. Ludwig van Beethoven's Sixth Symphony and Robert Schumann's Cello Concerto were written 4 decades apart, but they have at least one thing in common. They were both misunderstood by the audiences and critics of their time, and in some ways they are still underappreciated for their musical innovation today. Schumann's handling of orchestral textures is criticized as heavy-handed and uninspiring, and his departures from convention in the Cello Concerto have been dismissed as products of his struggles with mental illness. The Beethoven Symphony, meanwhile, doesn't fit neatly into a category. It's not quite a conventional symphony in form, not quite a programmatic work in its narrative, nor does it carry the heroic ideals of the composer's other middle period compositions. Although we will open Saturday's concert with the Schumann, I would first like to say a few words about the Beethoven, which is the earlier of the two works. The Sixth Symphony, nicknamed the Pastoral, was premiered in December 1808 at a mammoth 4-hour-long concert at the Theater an der Wien in Vienna. Although Beethoven was just starting to distinguish himself from the numerous other composers in the city, opportunities to have new works performed were still hard to come by, so he had to organize the whole concert himself. It was plagued with problems. Beethoven crammed in a lot of music, including the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, so it was all under-rehearsed. Many of Vienna's best musicians were booked for a charity concert the same night, and the theater was uncomfortably cold. But it was well attended, and Beethoven was satisfied enough with the performances of the two new symphonies to pursue their publication the following year. The Sixth Symphony, the one on our program, is not only unlike the Fifth, it is extremely atypical for works from this period in Beethoven's career, often called the heroic period. As the composer struggled to come to terms with his hearing loss in the first decade of the 1800s, the theme of triumph over adversity pervaded his music, especially the Third and Fifth Symphonies. These works took the form of a journey, presenting some kind of struggle or problem at the beginning and resolving it by the end, usually in a blaze of glory. By contrast, as we'll see, the Sixth Symphony embraces a sense of peace and stability throughout, with only a brief interruption. Critics didn't know what to make of it at first. The typical structure of a symphony had been well established by Haydn, among others, and programmatic works, music that told a story or painted a specific picture, were also pretty common, but this piece isn't quite one or the other. Beethoven opens, as symphonies of the time usually did, with an upbeat first movement and then a slow second movement, both in forms that audiences would recognize. Only there isn't really any conflict to be overcome. The music doesn't seem to be in a rush to go anywhere, often sitting on stable harmonies for many bars at a time. It's also not taking the listener on any kind of narrative journey, at least not yet. So what's going on? The descriptive titles Beethoven attached to the movements give us a clue. The first says, "Awakening of more cheerful feelings upon arrival in the country," and the second, simply, "Scene by the brook." Beethoven is slowing down the pace of the music to try and depict the serenity of life in the countryside, which he loved so much. He explicitly cautioned that the symphony was supposed to be mehr Ausdruck der Empfindung als Malerei, more an expression of feelings than painting. And yet, he allowed himself one direct reference at the end of the second movement, musically imitating the calls of a nightingale, a quail, and a cuckoo. The third movement, titled Merry Gathering of Country Folk, does also contain long stretches without any harmonic movement, but the lively tempo and dance-like rhythms give them more of a sense of anticipation, the literal calm before the fourth movement's storm. While the third movement would have been readily understood as a symphonic scherzo, the fourth movement throws all formal conventions out the window. And it stands out even more because many of Beethoven's typical dramatic devices, which he had withheld until now, minor keys, intense chromaticism, sudden and forceful changes in dynamics and orchestration, are used here in the fourth movement to depict the thunder and lightning that disturb his pastoral paradise. The final movement is titled Shepherd's Song, Grateful Feelings After the Storm. And as it begins, we become aware that Beethoven has brought us right back where we started, back to the tranquil land of suspended time and slow-moving harmonies. There has been no heroic journey, and the countryside has remained unchanged. This last movement on its own could be understood in symphonic terms, but the events that we have witnessed give it a different meaning. Perhaps it is we who have been transformed instead. Critics of Beethoven's time who tried to evaluate the Sixth as a purely symphonic work found it too unconventional. Those who later claimed it was an early example of romantic program music found that it lacked a coherent narrative. But Beethoven's real accomplishment here, what both of these groups are missing, is how he merges the symphonic and programmatic models in such an innovative way in order to convey his warm feelings of the timeless and beautiful countryside. Beethoven's symphonic legacy loomed large over the composers who followed him in the mid and late 19th century, and Robert Schumann was no exception. I want to highlight two particular ways in which Beethoven's influence can be seen in Schumann's orchestral music, including the Fourth Symphony, which the orchestra and I were preparing for performance last spring, and the Cello Concerto, which opens the current program. The first is the way in which Beethoven blurred the boundaries between movements of symphonic works. So in both his Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, the final movements flow directly from one to the next, instead of pausing in between. Similarly, the three movements of Schumann's Cello Concerto, if you can even call them that, are linked together without a break. Beethoven also used a basic musical idea, a motive, to create greater coherence throughout some of his works. This is most obvious in his Fifth Symphony, where that famous opening motive, ba-ba-ba-ba, becomes the basis for much of the music, not only in the first movement, but the others as well. In much the same way, Schumann transforms two related ideas from the very opening of the Cello Concerto throughout the work. The woodwind chords, which are the very first thing that you hear, and then the ascending figure that introduces the solo cello a couple bars later. Both of these techniques, connecting movements together and motivic transformation, serve to provide a piece of music such as the Cello Concerto with a sense of unity, a sense of wholeness. Now, Schumann gets a lot of flack in general for his orchestrations, and in this piece in particular for the tempos and overall character. You see, concertos are more typically flashy, extroverted, and virtuosic. I mean, that's not to say that this cello concerto isn't quite difficult. It is, and our wonderful soloist Samantha Yang handles it very well. But rather than exuberance, Schumann's concerto goes through moods of anxiety, inward passion, and then cautious optimism. Let's say a more realistic approach. Usually a concerto also has a cadenza near the end, an opportunity for the soloist to play freely without the orchestra. Schumann gives us instead a rare accompanied cadenza, which was unheard of at that time. Because Schumann struggled with mental health throughout his life, eventually developing hallucinations and then admitting himself to an institution, people often chalk up unconventional ideas in his music to his supposed instability. However, more recent research shows that he was doing quite well when he composed the concerto, which he did rather quickly, over just 2 weeks in October 1850. We can now recognize those unconventional ideas as Schumann's own brilliant innovations, carrying Beethoven's trailblazing spirit to new heights. I want to point out one last thing. When you watch our performance, you might notice that the string sections are not where you're used to. Instead of all the violins on our left and the cellos on our right, you'll see the cellos on my left, inside the first violins, and the second violins on my right-hand side. Although this arrangement is unusual today, it was certainly more common when these pieces were first performed in the 19th century. It makes unity among the string sections more challenging, but this arrangement serves two purposes for this concert. First, it highlights the back and forth dialogue between the violin sections in many parts of the Beethoven symphony. More importantly, it brings the principal cello of the orchestra closer to the cello soloist for a unique and beautiful duet in the second movement of the concerto. I certainly hope that you'll be able to hear the difference that this seating arrangement makes. Together, these two works, Schumann's Cello Concerto and Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, make an excellent program to kick off the orchestra's new season. On behalf of the Board of Directors and all of our musicians, I hope you enjoy the concert.